A major blow to Ontario's auto industry. Stellantis is moving production from an assembly plant in Brampton to the U.S. It leaves hundreds, thousands of jobs up in the air, and it's raising serious concerns for the future of the Ontario auto sector. We are diving into this now with our City Talks panel. Joining me is Celina Caesar-Chavannes, Ginny, Roth, and Erin, Morrison. Thank you all for coming here. Now, this, of course, comes amidst Donald Trump's threats that he wants all of the auto industry coming out of the U.S. at Canada's expense. Celina, what, if any, options does Prime Minister Mark Carney have here?
Yeah, this is a really tough one. As someone who grew up in Brampton, but also now lives in Durham region with GM, the auto sector is a critical component of our country and in particular of Ontario. He really needs to play a balancing game with this one. There are families at stake here.
But what options? Yes, he has to balance this, but what can he do?
The options are tough. The options are tough, especially with an integrated auto sector as we do with the United States. This is going to be a very difficult balancing act. Diversifying our trade is one of the things that we can do, but there's very, very serious consequences if he doesn't come up with a solution for Brampton really quickly.
Erin.
Both Mark Carney and Doug Ford ran their elections on we can stand up to Donald Trump, we can fight for Ontario jobs, we can fight for Canadian jobs, and it's been loss after loss after loss. Right. Ontario has suffered auto job losses in Ingersoll, Alliston, Loyalist Township, now Brampton. This is a serious problem. There are 800,000 Ontarians looking for a job right now. So I think what Canadians want to see and what Ontarians want to see is a more aggressive strategy out of both Mark Carney and Doug Ford. Going on TV and complaining about it is not helping Premier Ford. Going to Washington and getting those jobs back is what you promised to do, and it's what Ontarians expect.
But they don't have the cards. Now, Ginny, I want to talk to you about the prairies, because this is really complex, and I think that Carney's in a no-win situation here because canola is facing 78% plus tariffs from China, and canola is often overlooked here in Ontario as a major producer. So what should Carney do? Save canola in the prairies or save the auto industry in Ontario?
Yeah, I think the Prime Minister would not like to make that choice and has been rejecting that choice as a premise. Look, the reality is the canola industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It is massively bigger than the Ottawa industry, which we forget, I think, in Ontario.
Definitely.
And there, I think for the West, it's evocative of a resource-intensive economy, an agricultural production economy, where for a long time we've had a federal government for more than a decade now that has said, keep your oil and gas in the ground, layering on taxes and regulations for the agricultural sector, and focusing on the, frankly, vote-rich regions of Ontario. Yes. It's often at the expense of Western Canada, and as we've seen, at the expense of all of Canada. Because when we're not thriving economically in the West, we're not thriving economically across the country. So I think it's a tough decision. I think ultimately the Prime Minister still needs to stand up to China. And China is as punished by its canola tariffs as we are. They get half their canola from Canada. And so there's an extent to which we can call their bluff, especially if we find new markets to sell into, and China may ultimately need to compromise. And so, the Prime Minister should treat that as such. But on auto, he's trapped. He's got short-term options to help preserve people's incomes, but over the long term, there's a real big question of what the future of the auto sector here looks like.
And you're all nodding your heads. Okay, let's quickly touch on India. It seems Canada is trying to thaw relations with India. Are they doing a good job?
I think that Anand has a strong stance. I remember going to Grenada. I'm from Grenada as a parliamentary secretary, and her being the first Indo-Canadian to be a minister in India actually has a precedent. But that should not be taken for granted, not to just have trade talks. But there's a whole slew of other issues that come with those talks. When we talk about immigration, when we talk about visas, when we talk about other things, they're sort of all connected and tied into that bundle. So I think Anand has an opportunity to not just talk about trade, but to have a little bit more of a nuanced approach, respecting the domestic market as well.
Do you two agree?
If she wants Canada to agree with her on trade with India, and we should, they're a major trading partner, and considering the size of their economy, they should be a bigger trading partner, she has to tell us the truth about security. We had this Liberal government not long ago expelling diplomats from Canada, India expelling Canadian diplomats from New Delhi. because of safety concerns, because the Canadian government told us they were terrorizing Canadian citizens. They were shooting up Canadian neighborhoods and Canadian businesses. Now she's reestablished diplomatic ties. Great, she should do that. But nobody is telling us what's happening with our safety and security.
Ginny, I'll give you the last word really quickly on this topic.
I think it's easy to overemphasize domestic politics when it comes to international relations. We see that we have a big immigrant community in Canada, big immigrant communities in Canada, and playing diaspora politics is sort of a quick and easy solution to dictate foreign policy. So I actually want to give the Prime Minister credit for not falling into that, especially if we're going to stand up to China. We have to have a strong relationship with India, and we have to get on a strong footing.
We have to talk about Ontario Premier Doug Ford. I think he shocked a crowd at a fireside chat with his revelations that he tried to take down a suspected thief. So we're going to listen to what he had to say.
So I was in my car. I said, screw this. I'm going after this guy. So and by this time, my heart's beating. I'm ticked off. So I go racing behind. No one can see. And I pull up behind him and jump out of the car. I said, buddy, what's in your bag? Nothing's in my bag. I said, buddy, I'm going to kick your ass all over the parking lot. Show me what's in your bag. And then I went on to tell him if I ever see him in the parking lot, he's going to get a beating like he's never got before.
I have to ask, this is fascinating. Is there any other politician in this country who could get away with that?
Not since Brad Wall in Saskatchewan. No, he's the first in years. He's the first in years.
He's the first in years. Ginny, what do you think? Is this is his brand?
This is the Premier's singular appeal. It is far and away his strongest approach to politics. People love it. That original Ford Nation voter is like exactly re-energized by this kind of, whether it's eating the ice cream or making a comment about how he, like many, I think,
pouring out a bottle of booze.
Pouring out a bottle of booze. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of average Ontarians would say, like, if there's going to be crime in my neighborhood, I'm going to stand up for my neighbors. I think that's a really compelling stance. Where I think the risk falls is eventually voters will say, I want policy results across the board. Mm-hmm. I want to make sure there's crime in no communities. And the Premier can't single-handedly fight off every criminal in Ontario. And so, eventually, I think voters will, especially if there's a stronger opposition in the months to come, will demand more in terms of policy. But for now, the folksy charm thing, it always works for him.
It works for him.
I don't know if it's a folksy charm thing.
Okay, I'll get to you in just a minute. I remember when I was covering Doug Ford extensively at Queen's Park, he goes off script, and even his staff wouldn't know, and they'd be like, how do we contain him? Is there a danger to this? You were starting
Absolutely.
to say, I don't know about this.
Absolutely. The ability for him to say that in as much as he sounds Trumpian is a privileged position for him to speak from. There are not many other people who could go on TV as a leader of a premier or as a political party and go on and say, I'm going to kick your anything all over the parking lot. That is a very privileged position that he has as a particular politician that none of us, and I'm looking at myself particularly, can get away with.
Yeah, could you imagine if Wab Kinew said that?
Yeah.
I mean, it would be a big problem. And I think Ontarians, I think politicians, and I think people who are voting really need to pay attention to the discourse that is happening in our political system and say, not here, not now, not ever, especially in Canada when we have a number of international issues and domestic issues that require a steady hand when people are really, really hurting right now.
I also think the folksiness is a fig leaf and it's wearing thin. He uses
Absolutely.
the folksiness to cover things up.
He just won his third majority, and he doesn't really have an opposition.
No doubt, but I mean, he did lose seats, but we're talking about a premier who's now third term, 8 years in. He's talking about crime being out of control. Buddy, if you want to blame somebody for crime, start looking in the mirror. Chasing down a guy in a Home Depot parking lot is not solving crime. You're the premier. Do something about it.
I think Erin makes a good point. I think the Premier loves the reaction of what you see on social media, which is like, technically he shouldn't be allowed to do this, because he loves that, because the average person goes, I don't care what's technically allowed. He sounds great. That's exactly what I would do in that situation. But where I think it does wear thin is exactly Erin's point, which is eventually they'll say, okay, but the crime's not going away.
Right.
So who's fixing it?
Okay, I have to end on this note. We could talk a lot longer about this, clearly. Thank you all for joining us. Great conversation.
Thank you.